In January 1981, a new CEO walked into the Porsche headquarters in Zuffenhausen, a suburb just north of Stuttgart, Germany. His name was Peter Schutz. He had been hired to rescue a company that had just recorded its first financial loss in its entire history, and he had about 60 seconds of warning before he discovered something that nobody had bothered to mention during the job interviews. The Porsche 911 was already scheduled for cancellation, the car that most people on Earth would name if you asked them to picture a Porsche. The rear engine, flat six round headlight silhouette that had been rolling out of that same factory since 1964, had been officially condemned by the company's own board of directors. The line on the production chart simply stopped. The 911 had been given a death date, and not even an ambitious one. That date was 1981. The year Schutz was standing there reading the chart, what happened in that room, and why the decision had been made in the first place, is one of the most revealing stories in automotive history. Because the Porsche 911 did not survive by accident. It did not survive because everyone always believed in it. It survived because it was stubborn in the exact same way its creators were stubborn. Because a machine that should have been replaced by something more rational, something more conventional, something that made more obvious sense, somehow kept refusing to go. That refusal says everything about what the 911 actually was, and most people who own one, admire one, or simply recognize that silhouette from 100 yards away have never been told the full story. Before the 911 existed, there was a different problem. By the late 1950s, the Porsche company in Zuffenhausen was running out of car. Not out of ideas, out of potential. The 356, the machine that had launched the Porsche name as a sports car maker in the late 1940s, was approaching the limits of what its engineering could deliver. It had started as an ingenious improvisation built from Volkswagen parts in a small workshop in Gmund, Austria, right after the Second World War. Ferry Porsche, son of Ferdinand, the company's founder, had assembled it because he wanted a sports car and couldn't find one he liked. He used what was available: the Beetle's chassis, the Beetle's engine, the Beetle's running gear, reshaped and refined into something lighter, faster, and genuinely exciting. It worked beyond anyone's expectations. The 356 became the foundation of a real company, a real factory, a real reputation, but it was still, underneath the skin, a Volkswagen derivative. And by the late 1950s, that inheritance had reached its engineering ceiling. Ferry Porsche knew it. As he later recalled, the plans for a replacement had already begun by 1956. The new car would need to be purpose-built from the ground up. No Volkswagen floor pan, no borrowed parts, no compromises inherited from a post-war shortage of materials. It would need to be, for the first time, entirely a Porsche. The responsibility for that design fell to Ferry Porsche's own son, Ferdinand Alexander Porsche, known within the family, and eventually to the automotive world, as Bootsy. He was 27 years old when the serious work began in 1962. He was working alongside an internal team that included engineer Hans Tomala and, critically, engineer Hans Mesger, who would eventually solve one of the project's most persistent technical problems. The car they were trying to build had a clear brief. It needed to be a sports car that was also genuinely usable. Something with more room than the cramped 356, a more powerful engine, better visibility, the ability to carry luggage. A grand touring machine rather than a pure race car for the road. Ferry Porsche wanted the fastback style. He wanted the 2+2 seating arrangement. He insisted on both of those even when other proposals offered alternatives. Those two decisions together forced every other decision that followed. Because a fastback roofline combined with a 2+2 layout meant the car couldn't carry its engine in the front. A front engine pushing power to the rear wheels would have consumed the cabin space Porsche needed. The only solution that preserved the layout Ferry Porsche demanded was the same layout the 356 had used. Engine at the back, air-cooled, mounted behind the rear axle. It was not necessarily the most logical choice, Engineers understood even then that placing the heaviest mechanical component at the rear of a car created a natural tendency toward instability. The weight distribution was biased toward the back, which meant the rear tires carried more of the load, which meant that if a driver pushed the car hard through a corner and then lifted off the throttle suddenly, the weight could shift forward, and the rear end, suddenly lighter, could break loose in ways that were difficult to correct. This was known. It was discussed. And Porsche built the car anyway. The logic was not that the rear engine layout was perfect. The logic was that it was manageable, that skilled engineering of the suspension, the chassis geometry, the tire sizes, could keep the car controllable, and that the benefits of the layout were real. A rear engine placed weight over the driven wheels, which gave the car extraordinary traction during acceleration. It freed space in the front for luggage. It allowed a low hood line that improved visibility. The engine itself, developed by Mezger and his team after an earlier design failed to produce enough power, was a 2.0-liter flat-six, air-cooled. It produced 130 horsepower, which was genuinely impressive for a production sports car in 1963. It could push the car from standstill to 100 kilometers per hour in around 9 seconds, and onward to a top speed of 210 kilometers per hour. On September 12, 1963, at the Frankfurt International Motor Show, the Internationale Automobilausstellung, held in Frankfurt every 2 years, the car made its public debut. It was called the Porsche 901. The crowd's reaction confirmed what the family had hoped. Interest was immediate. The shape, those flowing lines, that sloping rear, the compact greenhouse, the rounded nose, felt simultaneously like the 356 and completely different from it. But then came the first problem, not from the market, not from engineers, from France. The French automaker Peugeot had already registered a trademark covering all model names that placed a zero between 2 digits. 3-digit numbers with a zero in the middle. The 901 fit that description exactly, and Peugeot held the rights to it. Within a year, Porsche quietly replaced a single digit. The car became the 911 on October 22, 1964. And the name that would outlast almost everything else in automotive history was chosen for the most bureaucratic of reasons. Production began in Zuffenhausen in September 1964. The factory, which had been producing Porsche sports cars since 1950 at that Stuttgart location, began assembling the car that would define the company. But definition came slowly, and it came with complications nobody had fully planned for. The 911's handling was demanding, not dangerous in the hands of skilled drivers, but unforgiving in the hands of drivers who underestimated what they were managing. The pendulum effect that engineers had known about from the beginning became real as customers pushed the car harder and faster. Lift off the throttle at the wrong moment in a corner, and the rear could swing wide without warning. The short wheelbase of the earliest cars made the reaction sharper. The bias toward oversteer was always present, always waiting. Porsche's response was continuous refinement rather than fundamental redesign. The wheelbase was lengthened in 1969. Weight was added to the front end to improve balance. Iron bars installed ahead of the front axle, a solution that carried its own compromises. Engineers worked constantly on suspension geometry, trying to tune out the car's worst tendencies without removing the character that made it feel like nothing else. Meanwhile, Porsche was building its reputation through racing. The 911 went onto circuits and rally stages and began winning. Not always, not easily, but consistently enough to establish that whatever the car's quirks on public roads, in the hands of prepared drivers on prepared tracks, the rear engine layout delivered something competitors found difficult to replicate. The traction out of corners was remarkable. The mechanical simplicity of the air-cooled engine was an advantage in the field. The 911 won rallies in European competition, accumulated results in international GT racing, and built a motorsport identity that began feeding back into the road car's reputation. This loop, racing success reinforcing road car desirability, road car sales funding racing, became the pattern Porsche would rely on for decades. Then came 1972, and an event that changed the 911's trajectory more decisively than anything that had come before. Porsche needed to enter the 911 in FIA Group 4 Special Grand Touring competition. The rules required the manufacturer to build at least 500 road-legal versions of any car entered in that category. That road car was the mechanism. The racing car was the goal. What Porsche created to satisfy the requirement was the 911 Carrera RS 2.7. About 15 engineers, led in testing by Peter Falk, developed the car from May 1972 onward. The goal was simple to state and difficult to achieve. Build the lightest, fastest production 911 possible without exceeding the minimum production requirement that would unlock racing eligibility. The bodywork was constructed from thinner sheet metal. The interior was stripped of anything that added weight without adding function. The rear bumper was fiberglass. The engine was enlarged to 2.7 liters and tuned to produce around 210 horsepower. And the rear of the car received something that had never appeared on a production 911 before: a small lip spoiler at the tail, designed to reduce the rear aerodynamic lift that contributed to high-speed instability. It earned the immediate nickname Ducktail. On October 5, 1972, the Carrera RS 2.7 was presented at the Paris Motor Show, held at the Porte de Versailles. Porsche had planned to build 500 and move on. By the end of November, all 500 were sold. The company continued building. By July 1973, production had tripled. The final total was 1,480 examples. And once the 1,000th was completed, the car qualified for Group 3 homologation as well. In its first full racing season, the 911 Carrera RSR, the competition version built on that homologation base, won 3 international championships and 7 national championships. In February 1973, Peter Gregg and Hurley Haywood took an RSR to the 24 Hours of Daytona and crossed the finish line with a lead of 22 laps, not seconds, laps. The ducktail was the detail that mattered most. A small aerodynamic addition had reduced rear lift by a significant margin, making the car dramatically more stable at high speed. It was engineering solving in inches what years of suspension work had only partially addressed. The 911 was no longer just a car that had survived its own contradictions. It was a car that had turned those contradictions into racing weapons. If you've enjoyed discovering the hidden history behind these machines, the best thing you can do right now is subscribe to the channel and share this video. Most of our audience watches from their TV, and sharing is what allows stories like this to reach more people. Every new viewer helps make this channel possible. But the racing success couldn't protect the 911 from what was about to arrive from across the Atlantic. The United States was Porsche's most important market. By the early 1970s, American buyers accounted for more than half of all Porsches sold globally. And America was changing its relationship with automobiles in ways that made the Porsche 911 a rear-engine, air-cooled sports car with demanding handling characteristics and a performance focus, increasingly difficult to justify to the regulators who were rewriting the rules. The Environmental Protection Agency had been established in 1970. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration was expanding its crash protection requirements. Emission standards were tightening year by year. The 1973 oil crisis, triggered by the OPEC embargo that sent fuel prices soaring across the Western world, added economic pressure to regulatory pressure. Americans who had been buying sports cars without much concern for fuel consumption were suddenly asking different questions. At Porsche, a new corporate structure was creating a different internal pressure. In 1972, Ferry Porsche had reorganized the company, changing it from the family-controlled operation it had always been into a publicly managed corporation, Porsche AG. His son Butzi, the designer of the 911, left the company. Ferry Porsche's nephew Ferdinand Piëch, who had been leading the engineering department with considerable success, also departed. A new executive board took control. At the head of that board sat Ernst Fuhrmann, a genuine Porsche veteran who had joined the company in 1947. and had designed the famous 4-cam racing engine used in the 356 Carrera and the 550 Spider. He knew Porsche deeply. He also knew that the 911, now nearly a decade old, was facing problems that he wasn't certain could be solved. American emissions regulations were becoming specific enough that adapting the 911's air-cooled flat six to meet them was an increasingly expensive and uncertain engineering challenge. Crash protection rules were demanding bumper redesigns that added weight to a car whose character depended on staying light. The 911 sales had been on a downward slide in the early 1970s. Foreman later recalled that nobody inside Porsche could say with certainty what the American regulations would eventually require, or when. The uncertainty itself was paralyzing. His conclusion was logical. The 911 was a dead end. Its fundamental engineering, rear engine, air-cooled, rear-wheel drive, compact chassis, was approaching the limit of what adaptation could achieve. Rather than spend the decade defending an outdated concept, Foreman wanted to define Porsche's future by building something different. That something different was the 928, a front-engine, water-cooled, V8-powered grand touring car. Longer, heavier, more conventional in layout, quieter, more comfortable, more aligned with what Foreman believed sophisticated buyers in the late 1970s wanted. The 928 was revealed in 1977 and immediately won Motor Trend's Car of the Year. Road and Track called it a technical achievement. The automotive press generally agreed that Foreman had built something impressive. The problem was that traditional Porsche customers didn't particularly want it. They came to Porsche dealerships asking about the 911. They looked at the 928, larger, more expensive, fundamentally different in character, and many of them left. The 911 that was supposed to be fading was still the car people came through the door wanting to buy. There was also an irony working against Foreman's strategy. At the same time he was preparing to replace the 911, he had authorized the development of one of the most extreme versions of that same car. In 1975, Porsche had introduced the 911 Turbo, internally designated the 930. It was, by any objective measure, one of the fastest and most intimidating production cars in the world. Its turbocharged flat six produced 260 horsepower at introduction and would grow from there. Its rear whale-tail spoiler was enormous. Its fender flares were aggressive. Its power delivery was violent. A turbocharged engine of that era produced little power below a certain engine speed and then delivered everything at once, a characteristic that demanded either real driving skill or genuine courage. It earned its nickname quickly, the Widowmaker. The reputation was partly accurate and partly legend, as such reputations tend to be. In the hands of drivers who understood what they were managing, the 930 Turbo was an extraordinary tool. In the hands of drivers who treated it like an ordinary fast car, it could end corners in ways nobody intended. The rear weight, the sudden arrival of turbo power, the absence of any electronic intervention. It was a car that pushed back, and it sold. Despite the reputation, despite the price, despite the physical demands, people wanted the Widowmaker. What Foreman had created was a situation where his plan to phase out the 911 was competing with a version of the 911 so compelling that it was drawing new buyers to the brand rather than pushing them toward the 928. By 1980, Porsche had recorded its first ever financial loss. The 928 hadn't replaced the 911. The 924, a front-engine water-cooled model developed partly for Volkswagen and adapted by Porsche, hadn't captured the buyers it was designed for, and the 911, battered by regulations and supposedly obsolete, was still the car that defined what Porsche was. Foreman left. The board decided it needed someone who understood American buyers. Ferry Porsche personally invited a Berlin-born, American-raised engineering executive named Peter Schutz to apply for the position. Schutz was not from the automotive world's upper circles. He had been born in Berlin, left as a child when his family fled Nazi Germany in 1937, and grown up in Chicago. He had a degree in mechanical engineering from the Illinois Institute of Technology and had spent his career at Caterpillar Tractor and Cummins Engine. He understood industrial machinery. He understood what American customers and American conditions actually required. And in January 1981, he walked into the Porsche headquarters in Zuffenhausen for his first weeks as chief executive. In his third week on the job, he walked down to the office of Helmuth Bott, Porsche's lead engineer, to review the development plans for the company's 3 model lines. On the wall of Bott's office hung a chart. It showed 3 lines representing the 911, the 928, and the 944. Another new front-engine model then in development. The 928 line rose steadily. The 944 line rose steadily. The 911 line stopped. In 1981, Schutz picked up a marker from Bott's desk. He extended the 911 line across the chart, across the wall, and out through the door. Then he turned to Bott. "Do we understand each other?" Bott nodded. That was how the Porsche 911 was saved, not through an impassioned board presentation, not through a detailed competitive analysis, through a line drawn on a wall and a nod. Schutz's decision was not simply sentimental. It was a reading of what the market was actually telling Porsche, as opposed to what the internal analysis had concluded. The 911 was not obsolete. It had reached the limits of what one version of its engineering could do under one generation of regulation. But the car itself, the fundamental concept of that rear-engine sports car, had not been exhausted. It had been mismanaged. What it needed was investment and development, not retirement. Under Schutz, the money that had been moving away from the 911 moved back toward it. Engineers who had been reassigned to other projects returned to improving the car that was still, against all predictions, the one that customers were asking for. The results were visible almost immediately. Porsche earnings, which had been below $5 million in 1982, rose to nearly $55 million by 1985. The turnaround was not built on the 928. It was built on the car that had been scheduled for death 4 years earlier. In 1982, Schutz oversaw Porsche's return to serious racing at Le Mans. The 24 hours of Le Mans at the Circuit de la Sarthe in France, the most demanding endurance race in the world. The Porsche 956 prototype, descended from the engineering knowledge accumulated across decades of 911 racing development, finished first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. It was one of the most dominant performances in Le Mans history. The 911 itself continued evolving. The 1984 model year brought the Carrera designation back to the standard road car, with a 3.2-liter engine that was the strongest, naturally aspirated version yet. A cabriolet version arrived, the open-top 911 that Schutz had championed specifically for American buyers who wanted sunshine with their sports car. The car grew more capable, more comfortable, and more reliable without becoming less demanding to drive well. The critics who had spent years explaining why the 911 was fundamentally wrong engine placement, wrong layout, wrong concept for the modern era, watched Porsche's recovery and had to reckon with the possibility that their logic had missed something the market understood instinctively. By the late 1980s, the 911 had become something more complicated than a sports car. It had become a statement in a decade defined by conspicuous success, the decade of investment banking bonuses, and the rapid expansion of private wealth in London, New York, and Frankfurt. The 911 Turbo became one of the objects that announced arrival, not in the way a Rolls-Royce announced it, which was the announcement of old money and deliberate reserve. The 911 Turbo announced something more aggressive: earned money, confidence, appetite, the whale tail, the wide body, the violent power delivery. It said something about the person willing to manage it. This was never a meaning Porsche had designed into the car. Ferry Porsche had wanted a comfortable touring machine with genuine sports car credentials. What he got 30 years later was a cultural signifier for a particular moment in Western economic history. The 911 had escaped its original purpose, not into military use, not into agricultural service, not into remote terrain the way other famous machines had escaped, but into the language of success. It appeared in films, in music videos, on magazine covers that had nothing to do with cars. The shape, by then as familiar as almost any manufactured object in the world, communicated something instantly: performance, achievement, a certain recklessness with consequences. The car that a careful German engineering team had designed to be a comfortable sporting tourer had become a shorthand for an entire attitude. Then came the third crisis. It arrived not from American regulators, not from internal corporate politics, but from the laws of thermodynamics. By the early 1990s, Porsche was under pressure again. A global economic slowdown had hit the company's sales hard. American buyers, always critical to the business, were purchasing fewer sports cars. And inside the engineering department at Weissach, Porsche's research and development center southwest of Stuttgart, an increasingly uncomfortable truth was being confronted. The air-cooled flat-six engine had been the sonic, mechanical heart of the 911 since 1963. It was the sound that Porsche customers recognized, the rasp and clatter that enthusiasts identified as the authentic voice of the car. It was also running out of room. Emissions regulations were continuing to tighten, and the air-cooled design was becoming progressively harder to tune to meet the standards being set in the United States, Europe, and Japan. Noise regulations were also advancing. The air-cooled engine, whose sound was celebrated by drivers, was becoming a liability in regulatory terms. And the limits of how much power could be extracted from it while keeping it reliable and emissions compliant were becoming clearer. The engineering conclusion was one that nobody inside the company relished reaching. The 911 would have to switch to water cooling. When the 996 generation 911 was revealed in 1997, the reaction from long-term Porsche customers was immediate, visceral, and prolonged. The air-cooled flat-six was gone. In its place was a water-cooled engine, the kind of conventional arrangement that mainstream sports cars used, the kind that Foreman had been moving toward with the 928 2 decades earlier. The new headlights, designed by Pinky Lai under chief designer Harm Lagai, shared their shape with the cheaper Boxster Roadster that Porsche was launching simultaneously. Porsche was sharing parts across models to reduce manufacturing costs. Enthusiasts called the headlights fried eggs. They wrote that the soul of the 911 had been removed, that Porsche had traded identity for commercial convenience, that the car was no longer really a 911 in any meaningful sense. The 996 also carried a specific technical problem that took years to fully surface. The intermediate shaft bearing, an internal engine component, could fail in ways that led to catastrophic engine damage. Not in all cars, not inevitably, but often enough that it became a known risk. A thing buyers researched before purchasing, a shadow over the car's early reputation. What the critics didn't say loudly enough at the time was what the water-cooled engine actually made possible. It made possible more power, more reliable power, cleaner power. The engineering headroom that had been exhausted in the air-cooled design was suddenly abundant again. Within the 996 generation, Porsche introduced the GT3, a track-focused road car using a naturally aspirated water-cooled engine that produced sensations nobody had claimed were impossible to achieve without air cooling. The GT3 became one of the most praised driver's cars of its generation. The 997 generation, which followed in 2004, addressed most of the 996's specific problems and re-established the refinement and quality that Porsche customers expected. The 991 generation, arriving in 2011, pushed the formula further. Each generation was more capable, more consistent, and more technologically advanced than the last. And each generation continued looking, unmistakably, like a 911. This was the detail that mattered more than any single technical change. Every generation changed the engineering underneath. Nothing changed the silhouette. The round headlights, disputed temporarily by the 996, returned in the 997, remained. The sloping roofline remained. The compact proportions relative to the car's actual capability remained. The rear engine weight bias remained. Every 10 years or so, the 911 changed fundamentally in ways that the people who loved it proclaimed were fatal to its identity. And every time, the car emerged on the other side still recognizable, still faster, still capable of doing things that engineers from other companies found difficult to fully replicate. The last generation in production today, the 992, carries a turbocharged flat six producing more than 400 horsepower in its base Carrera version. The Turbo S version exceeds 640 horsepower. The GT3, using a naturally aspirated engine that would have been described as extraordinary in any era, spins to nearly 9,000 revolutions per minute. The factory in Zuffenhausen, on the same streets in Stuttgart, where the 911 line began in 1964, is still building the car. Building 41, constructed in 1969 along Schwieberdinger Straße, still handles final assembly. The tools have changed. The robots have arrived. The process has evolved beyond recognition from the era when craftsmen assembled the 901 by hand. The car has been declared dead, or effectively dead, or commercially unsustainable, or physically obsolete, at least 3 times by people inside the company who knew it as well as anyone. It has survived each time, not because of sentiment, and not because the people who loved it were louder than the people who wanted to replace it. It survived because the thing it did. The specific combination of traction and steering feel and feedback and compact ferocity that the rear engine layout, refined over 6 decades, eventually learned to produce, turned out to be genuinely difficult to replicate by conventional means. Every time a competitor built a mid-engine sports car, or a front-engine sports car, or a turbocharged front-engine sports car, buyers who had driven a 911 found themselves returning to Zuffenhausen, the car that shouldn't have worked, the one with the engine in the wrong place, the one that the most experienced automotive engineers of the 1970s said had reached its limit, the one that a board of directors had scheduled for termination, is now the longest continuously produced sports car in automotive history. The great irony is not that the 911 survived. The great irony is what it survived against. It survived against the opinion of people who had designed some of the finest engines Porsche ever built. It survived against the rational conclusion that the regulations of the 1970s made it unviable. It survived against a replacement car that won awards the year it was launched, and then quietly failed to replace anything. It survived against the engineering community's consensus that a rear engine creates problems better solved by putting the engine somewhere else, and the man who saved it, by drawing a line on a wall in a Zuffenhausen office in his 3rd week as chief executive, was not a Porsche family member, not a German automotive insider, not an engineer who had devoted his life to the flat six. He was a child who had fled Berlin in 1937, grown up in Chicago, and spent his career building diesel engines for industrial machinery. He walked into that office with no personal history with the 911 and emerged as the person most responsible for its continued existence. Ferry Porsche had wanted a comfortable sporting tourer. Butzi Porsche had shaped it into a design that 6 decades of successors have refused to substantially change. Ernst Foreman had concluded it was finished. Peter Schutz had decided it wasn't. The engineering teams at Weissach had turned it into something their predecessors never imagined. The buyers, in California, and in Tokyo, and in Sao Paulo, and in London, had refused to let its meaning stay fixed. A car built to solve a specific problem in 1963 became something its creators never designed. Not a replacement for the 356, not a German touring machine, not an obsolete design from the last century. Something closer to a continuous argument that the most obvious engineering solution is not always the most interesting one. That the things people declare finished have a way of returning. When you see a 911 today, that silhouette, that rear engine shape, those round eyes looking out from the front, you are looking at a machine that has been cancelled, defended, mourned, condemned, and redeemed. Usually by the same people, in different decades, with different reasons. And it is still being built, in Zuffenhausen, on the same ground where it began. The car that refused to die is still refusing. The 911 proved that a car's survival sometimes depends less on its engineering than on the person who draws the line. And somewhere in Italy, a few years before that line was drawn, two companies were already locked in a rivalry that would produce some of the most extreme road cars the world had ever seen, and one of the strangest industrial competitions in automotive history.